Good morning, everyone. It's Friday, the 7th of July. Thank you to everybody who's joined us in the session today, and for everybody who's contributed towards the conversations going on in the chat room. So great to have so many people joining us today on this important session. So my name is Janet Wildman. I'm going to be your host today. And we're going to be talking about a new mandate to support community action. And we're looking at the practical insights that will come out of this session today for leaders. So we're hopefully going to be joined by Jeremy Taylor, but right now we know that we have Cormac Russell on the line waiting to go. So if you are joining us today, what we'd like to do is we'd like to make this session as engaging and as participative as possible. We know that you've spared the morning to come onto this call because you've got some questions that you want answered. So why not please tweet using the hashtag #EdgeTalks and the handle @HorizonsNHS and @SchoolForChange. And that'd be great for us to continue the conversation and to bring in other people outside of this session into the room, into the conversation, and let's get as much opinions and perspectives on this important issue. So let's move on. So this is who I am. This is what I look like. Possibly not today, but that's generally how I look. I'm going to be chairing the session, and I'm also going to be keeping an eye on Twitter and feeding back to you at different times of the session, just giving you an update as to what the conversation's like on Twitter. I'd like to also introduce you to Paul Woodley. He's the technical guru in our team, and he's also going to be looking at the chat room conversations as well. He's a fantastic guy to get to know, and a real pleasure to work with. So without further ado, I'd like to really introduce you to our presenters today. And first on the deck is going to be Cormac Russell, and he's the Managing Director of Development. And the thing about, he's the Managing Director of Nurture Development. He's also the author of #ABCD, and I met with Russell yesterday, and he's fantastic and very passionate about how do we engage with diverse communities and what does it actually look like and feel like. So he's also written a book, Looking Back to Look Forward. I haven't read that as yet, but I'm looking forward to a deep dive into that, but maybe he can tell us a little bit more about that in the session today. We're hopefully going to be joined by Jeremy Taylor. He's the Chief Executive of National Voices, and he also has a passion in terms of person-centered care, citizen engagement, and also works very closely with the voluntary and community sector. So those are the presenters today. I'm going to hand over to Cormac Russell, who's going to talk to us about his ABCDE learning sites and partnership in continuous learning. And if you've got questions for Russell during the session, then please just enter that into the chat room or post it on Twitter. We'll keep an eye on that. So over to you, Cormac.
Thanks, Janet. Good morning, folks. Good to be with you this morning. I'm actually in Croydon as well, different part of Croydon to Janet, but it's sunny here too. So good to be with you on a bright sunny day. What I'm going to do is, for about 20 minutes or so, is talk very practically about a question that really isn't about person-centered care, but much more about how do you grow connected communities that are health-producing and health-creating. And I think that, by the way, is a very different question than the question most folks are asking in health at the moment. I think the predominant narrative is around person-centered care and strength-based practice, which is good. It's positive, but I'm really interested in community work and how we can create a culture of health production at community level. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to try and stay away from theory and stay very, very practical. So effectively what I'm going to give you is 8 top tips around what we've learned over the last 21 years in 35 countries of actually working at neighborhood level. A lot of neighborhoods that people, quite frankly, had written off. And there isn't a Hollywood ending to any of these stories, but what has happened is people, despite the challenges they face, have really begun to use what they have to create much healthier outcomes for themselves and their neighbours. So that's what I'm going to focus in on. The top tips, or what I call the touchstones, are listed here in this slide, and I'm just going to really quickly go through them because 20 minutes is not a lot of time, but hopefully what you'll have at the end of it is a narrative which takes you from going into a community, hopefully having been advised, as opposed to colonially arriving in, like so many did in Africa and other places, but actually going in, having been invited to be in a neighborhood as somebody who walks alongside a community and supports them, right through to your exit strategy and how you can leave behind a legacy that's owned by the community rather than something that we're slapping ourselves on the back for having created. And I think that's an important thing to point out here, that what we're talking about doing is not empowering people, but it's about liberating power that's in communities and is often undervalued, unconnected, or just simply invisible. So let's get cracking. We all know the metaphor of the glass half full, the glass half empty. The answer to the question, is the glass half full or half empty, is yes, because it's both. But what I'm talking about today is making the half full part of the glass, what is there in communities, more visible, and doing it in a way that isn't about doing it for communities, but enabling communities to do it together. We've spent the last 8 years in particular in the UK working on what we call learning sites, and essentially you see some of them listed there. There's 15 in total, in fact. You see 12 on the map there, and behind them there's about 100 neighbourhoods where we've really begun to kind of ask the question, instead of how do you do things that add value to, for, or with community, how, as helping professionals or as volunteers, or indeed even as people who are just living in a neighbourhood, how can we be helpful in creating space for neighbour-to-neighbour connection and for people to create the things that matter to them where they live? So that's the question. And I think as a question, it's not going to answer every single issue or problem that we face in health or social care. It's not actually meant to. I'm not presenting this as a panacea, really just as one way of thinking about the challenges we face. So from here on in, I'm going to be very much thinking about the primary unit of change as the neighbourhood and not the individual or their pathology or their condition. The learnings don't just come from the UK, they come from 35 other countries, including Australia, and you'll see some of the learning sites where we're working quite deeply at street level with local people to really figure out what a health-producing community looks like. I love this. This is an example of people using social media, but also connecting on land. 3 women wanted to organize a teddy bears picnic with mums locally in Kalamunda, and they were told by the council that they needed a permit to gather in a public park if there was over 5 people. So the 3 of them arrived and then sent a message out through Facebook that they were there, and 495 other people came as well, just reminding us that an awful lot of community action is about fun and being a bit mischievous and asking for forgiveness rather than permission. These guys didn't even ask for forgiveness, bless them. So the 8 touchstones, a couple of things to say on them. One is they're not linear, they're messy, they look like this, and I think they're neither simple nor complicated. It's not like baking a cake or sending a rocket to the moon. It's much more like raising kids. It's complex. That's one of the big problems we have in working with communities. We want the work to be simple, or we want it to be a science. So we either want it to be simply measured, or we want it to solve all the world's problems. It doesn't either. Let's just start then with first top tip. Find a group of local people who actually want you to be in the neighbourhood. There's an awful lot of people who are really cool and quite active in communities who don't chair meetings and don't want to sit in our panels and don't like being called volunteers and don't like the term patients and don't really want to have anything to do with the professional world. And actually they're pretty cool. and they do a lot of awesome stuff. And a lot of the time they avoid bureaucracy like the plague. So if we want to engage with folks that are really good at initiating mutual connections and building a culture of community at local level, I think we need to find a different calling. So, you know, instead of inviting people to come to meetings, we should be trying to get ourselves invited to their parties. Really, I think what I found interesting in community life is that there are lots of different players, as we know, in a neighborhood or in a small bounded place like a village or an estate. So we have the leaders who are really, really important. They're the people who are very good at bringing people together around issues. We have gift givers. So many people, if you ask them, are prepared to actually contribute to the well-being of the community. But we also have a lot of labeled people who've been rendered invisible because of their label, who we need to actively find a way of lifting off their labels and inviting their gifts into community life, whether that's making a cup of tea at the AA group or whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be anything tremendously earth-shattering or world-changing, but it's about participation. I was at an event in Doncaster where myself and Professor David Best double-acted the other day, and David made a tremendously important point about saying, look, it's not enough if you're in recovery just to turn up and sit at the back of the room of an AA meeting. You've actually got to be involved, even if it's just to make the tea. It's the participation that determines recovery, not just showing up. Despite the fact that Andy Warhol says 80% of success is showing up, it's actually not. Connection is critical, and the connection has to be about participation, about reciprocity, about exchange. So we've got to show up and contribute. The people who are really fantastic at bridging folk who are at the edge of our communities into an activity that is about showing up and about reciprocity are what I call community builders, or sometimes I call them connectors. I love the term connector because a connector is not somebody who's trying to lead you somewhere. They're trying to connect you with somebody else. They haven't predefined a worthy outcome to the relationship. They just really like the idea that you guys have gotten connected together and that something might happen from there. They're gift-centered. In other words, as well as recognizing we all have fallibilities and we all have problems, they see the gifts in people. They can really see beyond your history, your story, and your label, and they're trusted. So in a sense, even though they're probably people who are in people's lives, if you like, they're not seen as interfering in people's lives. So in many respects, we find that finding connectors is more important than finding leaders. The second thing is that if you've got a community of 5,000 people, you know, it's fantastic that there's so many people who are weaving their community together and quite naturally building connections. But it's hard work when you're trying to raise kids, you're trying to live your life, or you're trying to live with a condition and live well with that condition, or support somebody to live well with dementia, or whatever life is throwing at you. It might just simply be you're just trying to get on with your daily life. It's not easy to do that and on a voluntary basis continue to build the connections of your community, because particularly in modern life, communities are places where so many people are probably more likely to be watching an episode of Neighbours or Friends than they are to be making friends with their neighbours. So we've really become quite disconnected in an awful lot of the places we live in. So one of the things that we've learned a lot over the last 20-odd years is that there's something really powerful about enabling a community to have a little bit of support. Not somebody who comes in top down from, you know, an outside agency and says, I'm here to heal you, or I'm here to do social care, or I'm here to get you to give up cigarettes, but somebody who comes in and says, actually, the objective of building community is building community. It's not to get better healthcare outcomes. It's not to get better social care outcomes. It's not to reduce crime or reduce demand. It's because community matters. And I'm here at your service to enable you to really get connected at that level. And that's such a powerful thing to be in a position to do. I often describe this professional as a community animator, and their job, if just to use a couple of metaphors, is to be the caddy, not the golfer. The local residents, the only people who can build community life are the people who live in that community, sleep in that community, and trade in that community. Outside professionals can come in and we can support the community to get more connected, more vibrant, and more powerful in its health-producing endeavors. But ultimately, the animator's job is to be Robin, not to be Batman. Their job is to be the sidekick and not to be the fixer or to be the inventor, if you like, of solutions. So having a community animator in a neighborhood who knows a lot about how to build relationships, not just individual to individual, but also relationships that are very tied into associational life, clubs, groups, associational networks that can really begin to open up space, particularly for many of the people that we're concerned about who maybe are pushed to the margins, the stranger at the edge. So the animator, I think, is a really important feature. And they have all the characteristics that we all know and love about folk who are really good at building relationships, and that's they're facilitators. They're not in providing a service or fixing people, so they're not about helping so much as being curious and really trying to find ways of connecting people for their gifts into the well-being of community life. So this is really about interdependence in community life rather than signposting people to inane activities or to, programs. Now, it's not that activities or programs don't matter, but I am really, really getting concerned at the amount of stuff that's being called community work, which is really just signposting and referral. And if I hear another story about an older lady that was referred to a basket weaving group who doesn't actually want to be at the basket weaving group simply because somebody thinks that's good community work, I'll scream. Good community work is about finding out what people care about enough to act upon themselves and then supporting them to get connected into that, not as a charity case, but as somebody with a gift to give themselves as well. You know, at the end of the day, this is fundamentally about life and not service. Like Clinton says in the chat room there, people want a life, not a service. They want interdependent relationships. Of course they want a service, but they want that there as the backdrop to their lives, not as the only game in town. So what is it that connectors and community builders do to build community and build that interdependence? I think what they do is the oldest trick in the book. They have this wonderful thing called conversations. And I love the fact that we live in a digital age up to a point, but they have conversations on land as well as online. And the interesting thing about having both is that they can complement each other and they can add value to each other. So hosting conversations, and what are those conversations about? They're about discovering what is in the community as our starting point and how we can use what we have to secure what we need. So really, these conversations shift the narrative which dominates health and social care, which is about what are we going to deliver today for the most needy person at the cheapest price. So we're shifting from this kind of delivery model to a discovery model, right? So how can we move from deliverables to discoverables? Jeremy, welcome. I see Jeremy's just joined us. So that's really what we're trying to do. And that's about hosting conversations that unearth what's in the community, but also in people. Sadly, an awful lot of people have gifts and have skills and have passions that are languishing. People just haven't discovered them. And conversations are this wonderful 70,000-year-old device that human beings have for enabling us to unearth the gifts that people have. We don't just talk to individuals, we also engage with clubs and groups. Associations are wonderful because associations are the engine room of community-powered change. So clubs and groups, in all their modesty, are the sociological basis upon which we take individual gifts and talents and they become amplified and multiplied. In plain, simple English, what that actually means is associations are where we go to do the things we can't do on our own. So I can sing like you would not believe in the shower, but actually my voice sounds a whole lot better in a choir, because a choir can actually cover up for a lot of my fallibilities, as well as accentuating some of my very modest gifts when it comes to singing. So we spend a lot of time with faith community, sport groups, environmental groups, women's groups, men's groups, AA groups, wherever we can go. And we're really interested in going to the places where these groups are and really understanding what's going on, what are they doing. My wife's a member of one of these groups, a book reading club. She's been a member of a book reading club for 17 years, and they have never read a book. Right? It's just wonderful. But obviously it's code for the fact that they're building mutuality. We see in all kinds of different ways people building associational life, from seed swapping to share fest to repair cafes to map jamming to a whole range of things. What we've done over the last 21 years is try to see if we can understand the topology of associational life. You'll get these slides, but this is my kind of modest attempt to map what we've seen in over 100 neighborhoods in terms of associational life in the UK. So this is a map of associational life. And what I mean by this is citizen organizations, groups, and networks where members do the work and are not paid. That's what I'm talking about. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it's a pretty thorough one. And I often say to community workers who come in and, we do a bit of mentoring, I say, okay, how many of these groups do you know? And if there are blind spots, we want to get out there and we want to meet these groups. And it doesn't matter whether they're interested in our agenda or not. They may care absolutely nothing about health in the narrowest sense of the definition, but actually they may have a huge amount to contribute to the health and well-being of a community. As well as building relationships and having conversations, we're really interested in working with people who've been marginalized, people who are really, really vulnerable to not having their gifts received. I don't like using the term vulnerable people, because I think it defines people by what we perceive them not to be able to do. I do resonate with the term that there are many people that we've pushed to the margins or exiled, and we've made them and rendered them completely vulnerable to having their gifts received as well as having their needs met. And I think one of the ways that we address that in community life, in neighborhood life, is really beginning to kind of figure out, how do we create social interaction activities, shareable moments where we can really actively say to people, where have you been all our lives and how have we ever lived without you? Really beginning to enable people to see that they are worthy and that their contributions not alone welcome, but it's essential. So we do all kinds of different things in that regard, and I'd love to have more time to tease that out with you. But do come to our workshop in Huddersfield if you want to kind of spend more time thinking about this. But ultimately, all of the relationship building, while it's important and it's intrinsically valuable in its own right, is also going somewhere strategically, if you like to use that term, at neighborhood level. We're really trying to understand how you can support 3,000 or 5,000 people in a bounded place to connect with each other, their environment, their culture, and their economy. Because we think that when you connect associational life with people's capacities, with the possibilities of the ecosystem, the economy, the culture, and the environment, then what you create is a whole range of health-producing possibilities. So when we get to a point critically, sometimes it could take a couple of years of good, solid, street-based community working and lots of conversations, thousands of conversations. Ultimately, we get to a point where we invite all of the associational life to come into conversation and to say, okay, so what have we figured out here? What are we actually learning? And beginning to think about visioning and planning. And we use 3 questions in the sequence that you see here. And these 3 questions, in a sense, will form part of our conversation later on. So the questions become, we're 2 years into building this community, looking forward, looking 10 years on. What can we do ourselves that we don't need any outside help or permission to do? First question. Second question, what can we do ourselves in the lead, but with some help from outside? So you could call this co-production, but the citizens are in the lead. Final question, what's left for outside agencies to do for us that we cannot do together with them or indeed alone, but that they would do in an accountable and transparent way. So that seems like an important sequence, and I suggest that often we only ask the third question and we leave the other two lie in abeyance. And the conversations look exactly like this. So this is not new ground. We know this. I think the critical thing is well done is better than well said. So a lot of our work is about actually moving into action and doing stuff and getting engaged, participating, not doing stuff well or badly. I think best practice is the enemy of better practice. I really don't think all helpful, particularly in our work, in community work, where we're just trying to encourage people to have a go and give each other a good listening to. So best practice and yardsticks and measurements and metrics and KPIs really don't come into our world. However, there's lots of things we can measure. You can measure whether associational life is getting deeper, whether people who weren't connected are more interdependent, and whether groups are taking civic action to drive change. We can measure all of those things. I suggest sometimes we don't want to measure them. What we want to measure is the number of clients we have and the number of programs for the cheapest amount of money that we possibly can get. So we're so hung up on efficiency, scalability, and measurability that we really are not actually focusing on what should be treasured instead of measured. So the doing stuff really, it builds collective efficacy. It builds a sense of I am somebody, I'm worthy, and I'm surrounded by people who are on the move here and are trying to do stuff to build a better tomorrow. And I think ultimately that's a source of tremendous celebration. So we spend a lot of time having parties instead of meetings, and we spend a lot of time fostering celebration. I said it before and I'll say it again as my concluding thought, that communities are like football matches where you've got thousands of people, telling everybody else what to do. Ultimately, there's 22 people in the football game who are doing all the hard work. They're the people who are the fittest in the whole scene. They're the people who least need the exercise, and often they're crushed by the responsibility of trying to do all of this community work. We hear so many volunteers saying, how do I get more people involved? Well, that's, I think, the wrong question. Instead of asking, how can we get more people involved in what we think activity or in our passion or in our program, I think what we should be asking is, how do we discover what people care about enough to act upon? And how do we co-conspire with them to enable them to get connected up and do the thing that they love, the thing that makes their eyes dance in their heads? It won't solve all problems, but by goodness, it will give people a life as well as a quality service. So the three shifts I think we're talking about here is from what's wrong in people's lives to what's strong in people's communities, from deliverables to discoverables, and finally ensuring the people we've defined as the problem secure the power to redefine the problem with their neighbours, not as clients, but as citizens. Thanks, folks. That's me.
Cormac, thank you so much for that. And it's been really busy in the chat room, less so on Twitter, but if I take the chat room first, people have really loved the language that you're using. Where can we hear more about that? Because it's very rare that we hear someone talk about communities from your perspective. So the issue around, for example, gifts, and how we really make use of that, and also the issue around power, the way that you frame that is so useful. So how do we as practitioners who want to support and want to get involved in communities, how do we unlearn some of the language that we're so used to using, because it can be quite patronizing? How do we unlearn that, and how can we adopt some of yeah.
Well, I mean, really practically speaking, there's there are a set of open workshops that we're running throughout the country, starting in September in Huddersfield, and we'll be running some in London and in other major conurbations throughout the UK as well. So you can find out about them on our website, and I think there's some information on the chat room. I'll just put up our website. The TED Talk might be something that people might like, TEDx, I should say, talk that people might like to check out as well. I think also the ABCD Institute is a really good place to go to really just spend a little bit of time listening to folks, very much speaking in this language, but speaking from the heart as well. So they're not just theorizing, they're really talking about how this works in practice. Or just go and visit. You know, I see that a few people from Bristol and Lancs, and there is some really beautiful work that's happening at neighborhood level, and I'm really struck by the power of just going out and actually spending some time in communities, listening to folks, telling you what they're doing to build community. So there are lots of opportunities. I think check out the 2 links that I've put up there as a starting point, and we'd love to see you at some of our open workshops as well, and really keep this conversation going.
Thank you so much, Cormac. We'll bring you back in later, but for now, what I'm seeing from the chat room is that everyone is saying this has been such an inspiration. They're going to take away the learning, and it's just been energizing for a number of people who have just sort of made some comments there in the chat room. And thank you for also sharing some of your resources with us. So I'm going to hand straight over to Jeremy, who's now with us. Are you there with us, Jeremy? Fantastic. So Jeremy's going to talk about healthy communities, powerful patients, what can health and care professions do. So I'm going to quickly hand over to Jeremy, and please do keep the conversation going in the chat room. And if you haven't joined us on Twitter yet, please do so. If you've got particular questions to ask to any one of our presenters, this is your opportunity to raise your hand or to let me know in the chat room, and we'll make sure that your voice is heard. So over to you, Jeremy.
Hi. Sorry I missed the first part of Cormac's presentation, but the last bit of it was great, and I could kind of infer the earlier bit. Also, I saw the slides earlier. So there is a connection between Cormac's presentation and mine, and I guess mine is about how do you take some of the wisdom and understanding and thinking that Cormac has shared into a world of formal health and care services. What is it that people in the NHS, in social care, in public health need to know, need to do that taps into the energy and strengths of communities, rather than always assuming that they are a source of problems to be fixed. And that's kind of our world. Incidentally, I'm looking at myself looking pretty horrible with a phone to my ear. I don't know if I'm being videoed to everybody. Perhaps somebody can tell me that offline. If not, I might just kill it because it's slightly putting me off. The other thing I need to know is, can I move my slides? Can I move my slides? I don't know. Perhaps somebody can tell me.
You should be able to, just go by going at the top part of the screen, you should be able to do that. You can see that there's a box there and there's arrows between them, so you should be able to quite quickly move on.
Yeah.
Either that or the arrow keys on your keyboard will move you, should move you left and right.
Left, okay. So while I'm trying to figure out how to move the slides, or maybe even ask if somebody could do it for me, because I don't seem to have
the... For you.
Yeah, well, that's okay. That's me. Let's move on. Next slide, please. I've just found a way of doing it. That's good. Maybe I've skipped a slide. There we are. National Voices. For those of you who don't know about our organisation, we've been going for nearly 10 years. We're a coalition of about 160 charities in the health and care world. And we essentially stand for 2 things. One, that people should be as much as possible in control of the things that affect their health and care. And as part of that, as much as possible, partners in decisions that affect their health and care. There's a very strong connection with Cormac's philosophy. It's not exactly the same, and in fact, to the extent that there's a tension between the world that we describe and the world that Cormac describes, I think there's some interesting opportunities for discussion. But we're about people having a voice and being in control, and we're also about the role that our own sector plays, the voluntary community and social enterprise sector, big and small organizations making a huge contribution to helping people have a voice, have a good quality of life, have good quality care. So that's us, and all the work that we do is relevant to those big themes. We talk about person-centered or person and community-centered approaches to care, or people-powered health. Actually, there isn't a consistent terminology that's used, and in fact, that's an interesting point for discussion. We tend not to talk about patient and public involvement because, rather echoing what Cormac said earlier, that sounds like a process invented by the NHS to get people to play on the NHS's turf, rather than thinking more holistically about what matters to people. So we think that health creation, community building, all the things that Cormac has been talking about is really, really powerful. But meanwhile, there is still sickness, disease, disability, frailty, and death. And millions of people living with long-term conditions. There is a huge amount that needs to be done to create the conditions where people living with illness and disability can be helped to do more for themselves, to do more for each other, to be less dependent upon statutory services. But there's still a need for agencies to come in. So going back to Cormac's 3 questions, the third question is, when do agencies need to come in and what do they need to do? What the evidence and learning, both from research and practice, tells us is that the more that the agencies work imbued by the philosophy that Cormac has described, the better the help will be that they deliver. And so then the question becomes, what is the role of people working as health and care professionals, as commissioners, as practitioners in the NHS and the wider health and care system? What is your role in working in these asset-based, people-powered ways, rather than in ways that we know have tended to characterize the NHS in particular for many decades, which is a tendency to assume that you have all the answers, a tendency to assume that the patients and people you're looking after have no agency or ability to do things for themselves. And it's what we call paternalism, married, I think, to what you might call bureaucratic managerialism. Those two things coming together can be a toxic mixture. That's a bit of a caricature, and in many ways I think the NHS is moving away from a paternalistic approach, but it hasn't got away from it entirely. And healthcare delivered through large bureaucratic government-run agencies tend to assume certain characteristics of paternalism as well, whatever the attitude of the individuals working in it. So we think people-powered approaches are really important, and we think there's a big evidence base to support that. I'm going to go to my next slide. I realise this is not the most up-to-date version of the slides, but never mind. I've got some questions for people, and I'm not quite sure, Janet, Paul, how this is going to work, but I thought I wanted to check where people were on a spectrum from being entirely familiar with and comfortable with their role in this and not at all, and just to check where people were, just to get some sense of the audience. I don't know whether we can still do that. I'm going to ask you, Janet, if there's a way of polling people on this.
I think Paul set up the poll. Yes?
Yeah, we've got the poll ready to go. It'll run for a couple of minutes once you ask me to start it. So if you just indicate when, and I'll hit it to go. And people will see it here on the right-hand side of their screen.
in planning this session, we thought it'd be quite interesting just for people to plot their own position, if you like, which you can do, I think, anonymously or in a named way. So over to you, Paul.
It's anonymous. Brilliant. Okay.
Great.
I've started the poll now. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you should see the 4 separate questions that Cormac would like you to respond to, and I can see that several of you have started doing that. Anybody who's in on an iPad may not have the functionality to do this, but the poll's only going to run for 2 minutes, so bear with us. You won't have to wait for long. And then once the poll results have completed, I'll share them with the group so you'll be able to see them and talk about them with everybody.
Can I talk while people are doing this?
Of course you can.
So I'm going to say a little bit more about the themes of these questions, but this is to check, are you familiar with some of the approaches? Do you think they are important? Do you think it's important for you to be doing them? Are you doing them? Some of you may already be practitioners of asset-based community development approaches, shared decision-making, a whole load of things which are about embracing people's own agency. Some of you may not be, but be interested. So I'm interested to get a sense of your own, if you like, investment, personal investment in this agenda. And I'll check whether what I've said makes any difference later on. That'll be interesting. And I think, am I right in thinking, Paul, that once the poll is done, then we get a sort of plot chart on the screen that shows the distribution of people's answers?
You'll get bar charts for each of the answers to show where the percentage of people who answered each question.
That sounds fun.
Okay, it's just compiling the data at the moment. I'll let you know once it's up.
Right. Okay. Shall I, while we're doing that, shall I move on?
Yes, please.
Okay.
So, just a little bit of background about the basis in law for some of these approaches. The Health and Social Care Act created a new duty on commissioners to ensure that services involved patients and carers. This was putting Andrew Lansley's famous "no decision about me without me" mantra into law. The CARE Act of 2014, actually in many ways a more radical piece of legislation than any healthcare legislation, because it started with the principle of individual well-being and the duties of statutory agencies to support and nurture people's well-being and to have regard to that in everything they do. This is not a complete list of relevant laws. It's just some highlights. The Social Value, the Public Services Social Value Act, or Social Value Act for short, really interesting piece of legislation that requires public authorities, when they're commissioning things, not only to think about the bottom line and cost, but to consider wider social, economic, and environmental benefits. A really important piece of legislation. All the evidence, including some that we undertook together with Social Enterprise UK earlier this year, shows that it is very little used in practice by the NHS and by local authorities. Fine words, important duties, but not actually put into place in practice. I think it's important to have some regard to the actual legal basis. What it shows is that lawmakers and policymakers believe that it's really important that health and care are collaborative exercises, not just things where agencies do things to people. I think that's sufficiently important to enshrine it in law, but it hasn't necessarily always influenced practice. Now, can we go back to, do we have the results of our little survey yet? And thank you, everybody, for taking part.
Yes.
Yep.
If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a polling option as a tab, which if you have a look at that, you can see how the results have come in. And for those of you who can't see it, maybe if you're on a tablet, we'll just quickly talk them through so you can see. When it comes to how important everybody thinks this is, there is pretty overwhelming support for this being a very crucial piece of work, how important the work is. But interestingly, far less people are very comfortable with the idea of it. So it could be that there is more education needed, or maybe people just haven't had direct experience of it. So they're aware of it in a theoretical sense, but don't have any practical experience of this working. Jeremy will no doubt be able to go into a bit more detail on that for people.
Yeah, it's interesting. And people think this is really important. And people think it's crucial for them to have a personal role in that. Actually that it can make a big difference. So I take from this that I'm talking to a pretty well informed group of participants. So I'll have to make sure I pitch it up and don't pitch it down. That's my conclusion from that poll. Thank you very much for that. You'll let me go to the next slide. The basis in evidence. I think that's quite important, particularly working in a culture, the NHS, medical research, lots of scientists and people trained in scientific ways. People like evidence and like to know the things they're doing are evidence-backed. And of course, there's a big debate about whose evidence and what kind of evidence. And sometimes in the world that we seek to influence, it sounds like people only take randomized controlled trials seriously and no other forms of evidence. But setting that aside, there's a whole load of things, shared decision-making when it comes to clinical treatment decisions, personalized care and support planning for people with long-term conditions, education and various kinds of support for people self-managing long-term conditions, peer support, health coaching, group activities, and asset-based approaches, not unlike the ones that Cormac was taking us through, but applied with a particular context of health and care. There is a big and growing evidence base for all of these approaches and more. So when I noticed in the chat earlier, some people were talking about, somebody made the comment, how do we convince people this is not the fluffy stuff, this is actually hardcore stuff? Well, one of the ways of doing that is to say that, you know, there is an evidence base for many of these approaches. So that's the basis in evidence. Here's a little slide that I sometimes use just as a snapshot from various surveys that are undertaken in health and social care, the adult inpatient care survey, the GP survey, and mental health, social care, end-of-life care. It's a bit of a reality check on how person-centered, people-powered the care is that people are receiving in different parts of the NHS and social care system. If people rely on the friends and family test to get their feedback about how good things are, they'll tend to get very, very high figures of satisfaction and rating. But if you ask people slightly more considered questions about their experience, you get a very mixed picture. I won't take you through all that data because we haven't got time. I sometimes show this to people on NHS leadership courses when we're talking about engagement and person-centered care and working with people and communities, even against the measures that the NHS itself uses, which are sometimes quite clunky. We have a very mixed picture. So, you know, there's a lot of room for improvement. We spend a lot of time in National Voices, a national umbrella group, working a lot nationally, but very interested in what happens locally, trying to work out what it is that the Department of Health and other agencies need to do to create the conditions in which people can work in much more people-powered ways, when they can be working in partnership with patients and communities, when they can be doing shared decision-making, when they can be actually putting into practice the things that are in law. And so we say these things, and these will be less relevant to individual practitioners, but it's important context. We're saying you've got all this policy. You've got the NHS 5-year forward view and the Chapter 2, which sets out a lot of this agenda. You've got the Social Value Act. You've got policy going back several decades on the importance of involving people. Why don't you make this stuff a priority? Because it doesn't feel like it is a priority with everything else that you're focusing on. We say it is really important to target the things that really matter to people, which aren't the same as the things that the NHS measures. We say measure what matters. And interestingly, it's a slightly different message from the one that Cormac was setting out earlier, which I think you were saying, Cormac, the things that you really treasure, you can't measure. I think there's a debate to be had about that. Actually, the NHS does measure quite a lot of things that do matter to people, like whether they were treated with dignity and respect and whether they felt involved in decisions. The thing that I think is missing is that people aren't held to account for their performance against that data. So if you lose control of the money or lose control of the waiting time targets, you can lose your job in the NHS if you're in a leadership position. But if you're delivering crap experience, you're not involving people, you're not doing care planning, it kind of doesn't matter. Nobody seems to care. So there's something about focusing on what really matters to people, measuring it, but also holding people to account for whether anything's happening against that. We think it's really important that the payment and incentive systems reflect what matters to people, paying for outcomes. And we think it's really important that people in health and care actually get training and development to enable them to work in more asset-based, people-powered ways. And our reflection is there isn't much of that except at the margin. And often in pre-service, pre-qualification training, which is then kind of forgotten later on when the real learning comes from your peers and superiors and you pick up bad habits. People are welcome to challenge me on any of this, by the way, because some of it is slightly assertion. But that's the sort of thing we're saying to national bodies. We're saying you should try and create the conditions for an engaging system along the lines of the 6 principles for engaging people and communities, which National Voices with friends and allies and colleagues helped to develop a couple of years ago as part of the 5-year forward view work. And I can say more about those principles if people are interested. We also say this isn't just about going through the motions. This is about actually trying as much as possible to do things with people, not doing them to people. And even doing for is kind of paternalistic. And when people talk about patient engagement and patient and public involvement and the things that the NHS does, which is sort of managing processes for involving people in our processes rather than their lives, if you like, actually that's probably mostly in the doing for part of that ladder. It's not really co-production. That's some kind of big picture stuff about how we think the whole system should be moving. I'm going to finish with just some tips based on our understanding and learning and practice and work in different parts of the system about what can individuals do, what can I personally do that makes a difference, almost regardless of the wider policy and funding context. We think it's something about a desire to improve things. So if you just want a quiet life, then you're probably not starting in the right place. One of the most depressing events I ever attended having just joined National Voices several years ago, I went to a round table. For my sins, I probably go to too many of those, which was about something to do with improving quality. And at the end of the round table, as we were walking out, one doctor leant across to me and said, "You know, Jeremy, you need to understand that a lot of doctors just want a quiet life. They don't want to be involved in all this improvement stuff." And I hope his views are not representative, but if they are, that's kind of depressing. So it kind of, for me, it's sort of taken for granted that you kind of want to be dissatisfied with the status quo and want to improve it. You want to be dissatisfied with the data that I showed you earlier. Something about valuing what really matters to people, and you can only do that by really understanding it, which is about, I think, having conversations. Something about, I think, focusing on those who have most to gain from people-centered approaches, and actually there's quite a lot of evidence amongst the various the bases of research and evidence that the people that we regard as the most vulnerable, certainly those who have the worst health outcomes and the worst access to services, are often those who most benefit from a different approach. So for us, person-centered approaches and a focus on inequality and disadvantage are absolutely part and parcel of the same thing. Valuing what people themselves can contribute, that's the direct link with Cormac's presentation. And again, there is a strong evidence base of that when people are able to bring what matters to them and their own agency to the table as individuals or as communities, it does actually make a difference to the outcomes. Being humble, I think, is really important. And actually, I don't want a service, I want a life. I think Cormac used exactly the same quote. You might take pride in having designed and run a service, but it turns out that actually people don't necessarily want or find relevant to their lives. To recognize that takes some humility and the ability to accept that not all of your professional validation can come from your peers. It has to come from whether it's working for the people you're serving, and being courageous enough to recognize that you may have got it wrong in some key respects. I think all of this is about social leadership. It's about the kind of leadership qualities that aren't about hierarchy, but about making things happen by bringing other people along with you in a shared enterprise. So that's something about values and mindset, and then some practices. Well, I've tried to keep this really basic. Having better conversations. That's what Cormac said. I think a lot of this is about the conversations that we have with our peers, with patients, with people in communities, with carers. I sometimes encounter within the healthcare world almost a fear of people that the outside the parameters of a protocol-driven conversation about medical matters, or outside a process of engagement that's been agreed. People get scared to have just human conversations. Collaborating goes without, almost goes without saying. Setting shared goals and reviewing progress, that I guess goes without saying almost. Quite a lot of evidence that, and this comes out of some of the work of a program called Realizing the Value that some of you may have heard of, and I'll say a little bit about it before I finish. If you want to change the culture of your organization, if you want to work in more person-centered ways, but you feel it's difficult because the culture of your organization is not friendly to that, then alongside the work you're doing within your organization, try and find allies and friends and peers in other organizations and team up with them and form networks. The power of networks is, I think there's a growing awareness of the importance of that. It's really important to make friends with your third sector, the voluntary community groups, local and indeed regional and national. We have a really important part to play. Where we don't have a monopoly on wisdom. The communities themselves have a lot of wisdom, and that was Cormac's thesis. And actually other colleagues in the first sector, which I think is, no, I've got it mixed up, first, second and third sectors, but other colleagues in the public sector, and let's not forget the business world and the private sector, because their role in creating or undermining a healthy environment is incredibly important. So I'm going to sum up by saying this is all about being humble enough to know that you don't have all the answers, that if you want to get good answers, you need to work with other people, that people and patients and communities are a source of a lot of the answers, not all of them. If you need a hernia operation, you've got to have a doctor to do that. But if you're living with COPD, you do need medical help, but you need a lot of other things that aren't about medicine. This is about having really good conversations and recognizing that healthcare is a human relational thing as well as a technocratic thing. I guess you all know this already. You're a pretty wised up audience looking at the poll. So I hope I've been able to add something to the fantastic presentation that we heard from Cormac, and I think I've almost used up all the time, for which apologies. I will now shut up. I've got a couple more slides. There's some resources. They'll be available. I won't do the questions again. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And everybody in the chat room are just sort of really engaged in all the things that you have presented to us. We've only got 1 minute left. I wanted to ask you and Cormac, what would you say is the #1 thing that you would include in when you think about social leadership? So you've mentioned, both of you have mentioned this across your presentation today, but give me one thing that you think would be absolutely critical to when we talk about social leadership. So I'm going to hand it over to you first of all, Cormac.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, great. I think the critical thing to do is to advance the conversation beyond person-centered and people's leadership capacity, even in social leadership, and not to replace that, but as well as that, to talk about cultivating good, solid leadership across associations. So we're also talking about culture change as well as personal behavioral change. And person-centered change. I think we need both in the conversation. My fear is that we're getting siloed into person-centered work, and we're not actually talking enough about community work and the leadership of cultures and the leadership of associational life. We need both. It's not either or. It's both and.
Thank you so much, Cormac. And over to you, Jeremy.
I think I would just keep it really simple and say, for those working in the health and care system, have better conversations and try and improve. And there's stuff you can't directly contribute to, but there's an awful lot that you can. And so believe in your own power to make change with other people.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of EdgeTalks and NHS Horizons Group, we want to say thank you to both of our guests. We want to say thank you to Cormac Russell and to Jeremy Taylor for really coming on board and sharing your insights and your thoughts on this very complex and difficult issue in one respect, but in another respect, it's actually taken us back to being human again. So thank you both, and I also like to thank all the participants who've been so active on the chat room. I know I'm slightly over the time limit today, but it's such an interesting subject. If you do want to continue the conversation, stay on the chat room for a little while, and we'll talk to you there. So for now, we just want to say thank you and have a fantastic weekend. Goodbye to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.